Hello Year 8 and welcome to your first flipped lesson. The idea behind these lessons is that you, for homework in preparation, learn the basics or learn some information that we're going to be teaching, and then from there we can go in class into much greater detail, or we can elaborate and do questions and do teamwork. And so this first video you're going to watch for homework is about the first body system that we're going to study in this unit, which is the digestive system. So if I might ask a primary student what the digestive system does, they might answer something along the lines of, well, it takes in the food and it produces the poo. Which I expect from a primary student, but obviously that wouldn't serve much of a purpose. Taking in food, making poo, what do we get out of that? We don't get anything from that. And so hopefully you can understand that the digestive system has more of a role, and more important than producing the poo is for it to actually take the nutrients that we require out of the food as the food is passing through the system. And so what we end up with at the end, the poo, is really the unwanted material, and that's a byproduct of the digestive system. So let's have a look. We're going to go through a step-by-step procedure of how the digestive system breaks down the food and gets the nutrients that we require, looking at each part of the digestive system one at a time. Okay, so this is an overview you might see in a textbook of the parts of the digestive system. And the first one that we're going to look at here is the mouth. So this is where we put the food, obviously. And there are a number of steps, really important steps involved in the mouth in order to help to break down the food. The first or almost obvious step is that of the teeth. The teeth are there to break down the food, crush it and grind it and cut it. This is a type of, we refer to this as mechanical digestion. It's mechanically by force crushing and breaking of the food. We've got 4 different types of tooth involved in this mechanical digestion. At the front we've got the incisors. These teeth are for cutting food, for getting food into the mouth initially, maybe for cutting a small piece off and getting it into the mouth. So the term incisor, similar to the word scissor, and obviously scissors cut things. That's the job of the incisors, to cut things. Next we have the canines. So again, this is linked. Canine is another term for a dog, and dogs, they tend to, especially in the wild, they tend to rip food, and that's what our canines are for. They're quite pointy, the canines, and if you put something into your mouth and then rip it rather than cutting it, something that maybe couldn't be cut, then it would be the job of the canines to do that. The other 2 types of tooth that we have in our mouth, the premolars and the molars, have a similar job to one another, and that's really for crushing and grinding of the food. The premolars are smaller and they sit after the canines, and then the molars at the back of the mouth, the largest teeth, they tend to be they've got a relatively flat surface. So when the molar on the top of the mouth comes down on top of the molar on the bottom of the mouth, then any food that's in between those teeth gets crushed. As well as the teeth, we produce saliva, and saliva has a very important role in the breakdown of food, and this we refer to as a chemical form of digestion. It's not physically being broken down or mechanically being broken down by the teeth, but there are chemicals within the saliva which we refer to as enzymes. And these chemicals act on the food to break bonds in between atoms of the food in order to increase the surface area of the food and begin the breakdown process. As well as the teeth and the saliva in the mouth, we've got a tongue in there which just helps to move the food around the mouth, so that you can move the food to the teeth to get crushed, or to move the food to the back of the mouth in order to be swallowed. Okay, so the next part that's labelled here is the epiglottis, and what the epiglottis is a flap of tissue that prevents the food from going down the wrong tube. There's another tube that's not shown on this picture here, which would lead down into your lungs. Obviously we don't want food to go down into the lungs. It's not going to get broken down or absorbed there, and so the epiglottis closes off this tube and forces the food and the water that you drink to go down this other tube down towards or down through the digestive system. There's some pictures showing the epiglottis. I think this one shows quite well here. This would be that trachea which goes down into your lungs, and this is the digestive system, which is where we want it to go. So this piece here just closes down over the top of the trachea to prevent the food from going down into the trachea. Okay, so this tube that I was just referring to that takes the food down into the digestive system, this is called the esophagus. And on the next slide, you can click on the video, and that's going to show you how the esophagus helps to make the food move down. If you're standing on your head, if you're upside down, then gravity wouldn't help to move the food along the esophagus and down into the next part of the digestive system, but it would still move down. This is through an action called peristalsis. A bit like squeezing a football or a tennis ball along a sock. If you had a tennis ball inside a sock, you'd squeeze just behind the tennis ball, squeeze the sock just behind the tennis ball, and the tennis ball would move along. That is how peristalsis helps to move the food along the esophagus. So click on the video on the next slide and you'll be able to view this taking place.
Door peristaltische bewegingen, dat wil zeggen onwillekeurig verlopende spiercontracties, komt het voedsel in het spijsverteringskanaal terecht. Deze golfachtige bewegingen vindt men in de slokdarm, maar ook in de maag en in de dikke en dunne darm.
So after the esophagus, the food ends up down in the stomach. And the stomach is essentially a bag of tissue where there is liquids inside and the food resides for a period of time. It's not where we get the nutrients out of the food. More digestion takes place in the stomach. The liquids that are in there are called gastric juices, and these are, as it says, very acidic. That acidity doesn't really help to break down the food, as some people think. Really, the acidity inside the stomach is more to kill any microorganisms that might be in the food, and if these microorganisms aren't killed, they could make you ill. And so there are also, as well as it being acidic, the gastric juices do contain some more enzymes, different enzymes, but in the same way as those enzymes in the mouth. These enzymes also help to chemically break the bonds in the food to help break down that food that's in the stomach. At the end of the stomach, there is a circular muscle called a sphincter. And so this is normally sealed off, so the muscle contracts and it seals off the end of the stomach. This keeps the food in the stomach for the required amount of time. And then periodically, the sphincter muscle would release, and that would open the passageway through out of the stomach, and so the food could move to the next part of the digestive system. As you see here, the sphincter, as well as being found at the end of the stomach to stop the food moving out of the stomach into the next part, there was also a sphincter at the anus to stop the feces from passing out of the anus at the end. Rather, you have to release that sphincter muscle or relax that sphincter muscle in order to allow the feces to pass out and into the toilet. So the next part of the digestive system, or the next parts, the food doesn't go into these parts, but these parts are involved by adding substances into the chamber or the part where the food is. So the food has gone in through the mouth, it's gone down the esophagus, and it's gone into the stomach. And then as it then passes out of the stomach, the liver, which is here, and the gallbladder, which is here, these two organs produce, or the liver produces a secretion, a liquid, that gets stored in the gallbladder, and then from the gallbladder it then passes into the chamber where the food is. So food doesn't come down and then go into the liver, but rather it stays in the stomach and then passes into the next part, which is actually called the small intestine, which is this part in the middle that's down here. But the gallbladder and the liver are involved in the process of digestion in a couple of different ways. So the liquid that is produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder and then passed through the bile duct into the chamber where the food is, this liquid is called bile. As it says down the bottom here, it has a couple of roles. Firstly, it's alkaline. Now, alkaline is the opposite to acidic, and so it actually neutralizes the acidic contents of the stomach and makes them they're no longer acidic, they're neutral. And this is important to allow other enzymes to work effectively. So it sort of counteracts or neutralizes the acidity in the stomach, because that has already done its job, which was killing as many microorganisms as might be in the stomach. It's also an emulsifier. An emulsifier is something that splits up droplets of fat. So one emulsifier that we use often is washing up liquid. If you've ever tried to wash up a saucepan or a frying pan that's got fat on it in just water alone, it's very hard to do. The fat stays in big blobs, whereas when you use washing up liquid with the water, it's much easier to wash up something like that, and because the fat sort of breaks up into tiny little droplets and spreads out through the liquid. And that's what the bile does in your intestines. It takes any fat that is in a globule or in a ball, and it breaks it up into smaller tiny bits. Obviously this is part of digestion, and it's aiding the breakdown of the food. And further to that, lastly, this also contains some more enzymes, chemically breaking down the food in order to so that it can be absorbed into your blood. Another part, just like the liver and the gallbladder, that the food doesn't go into, but again produces a liquid or a secretion, is the pancreas. So in the same way, from the pancreas, this secretion from the pancreas, the pancreatic secretion, pancreatic juices, they are passed out, and you can see this yellow organ here is the pancreas, and then from here the pancreatic secretion comes into the next part of the digestive system, which is the small intestine. It also doesn't show, but just behind here, this is where the bile would pass into the small intestine also. Similar in role to that of the bile in many ways, in that it contains enzymes also to help break down, different enzymes, but contains enzymes to help break down the food, and is alkaline to combat that acidity from the stomach. Okay, so I already talked about it a number of times, but the next part of the digestive system is the small intestine, the brown coloured region down here, which collects the food after it has been in the stomach. Through the sphincter, it passes then into the small intestine. The job of the small intestine is the most important job in the whole of the digestive system. This is where the nutrients that have now been broken down can then pass through the small intestine and into the blood. So the blood can get all of the nutrients that it requires for the body to function, and they can be transported in the blood around the body to wherever they're needed. You can see that the small intestine is really well packaged up. It's all twisted and packaged into this small area. This is that now allows it to be a very, very long organ, but not to take up too much room. It's very long to allow as much absorption. Absorption is the movement of the nutrients into the blood. It's very long to allow as much absorption as possible to take place, so that we can get the nutrients that we require. The next slide, there's a video. You can click on the video, and that shows you the internal structure of the small intestine, it has these, inside the small intestine, inside the tube, they have protrusions sticking out that almost look like fingers. These are called villi, and the villi, by having this sort of finger-like projections on the inside, that really increases the surface area inside the tube to allow as much of the nutrients as possible to get absorbed into the blood. And so after the small intestine, we've got almost all of the useful substances out of the food that we want, and they've been absorbed into the blood. From the small intestine, then it then passes into the large intestine, which is much shorter but wider than the small intestine. So the large intestine does also actually take some useful substances out, or useful substance out of the food that's left. Whatever is left at this point does take the water out, so its role is to absorb any excess water. And apart from water, what's left in there is what is going to essentially form the feces at the end. And so, as you can see, as the bits of food, as they pass along the large intestine, they begin to get clumped together. And this is going to form the feces. But all the way along here, water is being taken out of the small intestine and going into the blood, so that we don't waste any water, or waste as little water as possible through the process of digestion. And then finally, the last two parts of the digestive system are the rectum and the anus. So these two parts are really concerned with the waste, the feces that's left at the end. The rectum is where it's stored. So this part here is the rectum. The feces is stored in the rectum. And then another sphincter muscle, like the one at the end of the stomach, when that relaxes, that allows the feces to pass out through the anus. So the anus is actually just the last part of the digestive system where the feces passes out. The rectum's just before that, where the feces is stored before it's passed out.